Hello and welcome back to Give the People What They Want. I'm Zoe Alexandra from People's Dispatch. That's Prasanth, an Indian journalist. We're back with many stories for you. Trade talks, ceasefire negotiations, what's happening. We'll go to all of that and more.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want. Your weekly movement news roundup.
Well, Prashanth, last week we left it at a very tense moment. India had just launched Operation Sindoor against Pakistan, allegedly launching limited military attacks within Pakistani territory in response to the Pahalgam attacks. That set off another wave of pretty intense rising tensions. It was very unclear how far that could go. Give us the latest. We know that this is not the only thing that's happening in the region right now. We know there's also a big upcoming strike. What's happening in India?
Right, Zoe. I mean, it's been quite a week, to say the least. And of course, I'll start off by saying that there is an immense sense of relief, both in India and I presume in Pakistan, over the ceasefire that was declared on the 10th. It was quite a sudden ceasefire, and everyone is in favor of ceasefires, whether they're sudden or expected or unexpected. But it's a good thing that a ceasefire was announced, and right now I think both sides are kind of consolidating. It's still quite tense, the atmosphere, I must be very honest. It's still quite tense, and both sides are kind of consolidating still. Both sides are declaring that they have won, that they have achieved their objectives. Now, the truth is likely to be somewhere in between when it comes to, and we'll come to some of these definitions, but when it comes to stated objectives of both these countries, the truth is likely to be somewhere in between. There's still a lot of lack of clear information. It's a digital age. There is a lot of misinformation, as we know. Obviously, there's a lot of secrecy. Both sides claiming that operations are continuing in some way or the other. So it is, still difficult to get very accurate information. We may even never know the exact details of what happened. So, I would say that, right now there's still quite a bit of tension, and at the same time, both sides kind of consolidating their position. But it does look on the positive side that there is definitely a decrease in tensions. Military level officials have talked about, are continuing their discussions. There's talk about a disengagement. All that is amazing. But to come back, I think, we talked about both sides declaring victory, and then there's this larger question of what constitutes victory itself in these kind of contexts. Now, it's very difficult to kind of, I don't need to say much, because we know that Vijay and Taimur last week had a very extensive discussion which really addressed, I think, many of these issues. But all I'll say is that, one would assume that the victory in this context for both governments, for both establishments, would constitute a safer region for the peoples of these two countries and the entire region. And of course, there's no safety for just one country's people, because these countries are so closely connected in so many senses. So it's kind of bizarre to say that, okay, we are safe and they're not safe, or we are safe because we made them unsafe, is kind of a really strange way to look at the situation. So I think that is a question that political leaders, analysts, all of them have to ask themselves, that this is, I think, the larger goal we are supposed to all be working towards, and how much has that been achieved is, I think, really the $1 million, $1 billion, whatever question that the leaders before have them. And I think that goes beyond strategic or tactical details of, how much was fired, what weapons worked, what weapons did not work, where was damage inflicted, etc., etc. Now, that's one part of it. I think the second question, very important, is regarding the role of the media. And I think, again, we talked about, disinformation in such situations. Of course, it's there everywhere. But I think it's more than the question of what kind of information was spread by the media, right? It is not just that individual bits of fake news were spread by media organizations. I think the larger question really is that what was the intent, or what was the guiding philosophy of so many of these media organizations in their coverage? And that, I think, is where the danger lies. You make a mistake while covering, even during a war, you make a mistake, you can maybe sometimes quickly withdraw it, try to kind of stem the damage. But if your guiding philosophy is something else entirely, and which is what we saw in the media coverage on both sides too, in many cases, but also I can definitely say that this is what we saw in India, especially from the mainstream media, then it poses very large questions to not only your media itself, but to the entire people, that what kind of media do we have? What are we kind of gaining, and what are we losing from this situation? And I think I'll switch here because I think it's going to be interesting to see that the same media and the way they covered this last few days, will they cover what is happening next week in India, which is on the 20th of May, we're going to have yet another massive all India strike. We're looking at what 200 to 250 million people who are likely to take part in that strike. Annual strikes have become they have become an almost annual affair in India. And it's important to note that almost all unions except the union of the associated with the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party are part of this. Despite their ideological differences, despite their differences in various positions, unions across the country are taking part. Massive all India strike. Their demands, I think, are demands which resonate across the world, right? They're demanding that the right to organize, which is seriously under threat because of various laws introduced by the government. They're fighting to defend their right to organize. They're fighting to defend their right for fixed working hours, because you've seen corporate heads all over the country saying we need to increase the working hours. They're fighting against the criminalization of, they're fighting against the dilution of norms in the workplace, which would enable more contractualization. They're fighting against the privatization, the loot of public resources. They're fighting against all these things. All of these are issues I think workers across the world are facing, and which is why it's important, I think, across the world to kind of see this kind of response. I think next week we'll talk a bit more about it, but I think it's very important to see which are the media organizations which are going to be covering this massive all India strike, or which are the media organizations which are just going to talk about traffic jams or completely ignore the strike altogether. And you will know that those media organizations are not on the side of the people. And I think that's a good, of course, the worker strike, very, very important. Those demands extremely important for across the world, but also I think important to look at who's saying what about this strike or who's not talking about this strike, to get a sense of where all of them stand in today's context. So yeah, very, very important week coming ahead for the people of India.
Well, and I just note here that it was interesting in the past week to see that the media organizations that were spinning lies, that were spreading misinformation, that were sharing blatantly false claims and accusations about what was happening and the attacks, their impact, those were somehow privileged. And then organizations that differed from that line, for example, The Wire and hundreds of accounts on X and YouTube, were actually censored and banned. So, as we're coming off the heels of Press Freedom Day, just kind of a week and a half ago, it's important to point out these deep contradictions. And for that, we're very thankful of the existence of alternative and independent media outlets that are able to actually challenge these and bring valid and dialogue, bring true fact-based reporting at such a time. War is not a time for spreading rumors and drumming up jingoism. So interesting moment there. Shifting to South America, just rapidly shift over continent. There's been an interesting, or rather tragic, trend that's been happening in the past couple of weeks, and really, it's a larger trend, and that is kind of the proliferation of violence in both the cities and in the countryside, exercised by armed groups. And this is something that at People's Dispatch we've been tracking, for example, in Ecuador for the past several years. We know with the kind of deep and intense cuts and attacks on institutions in the country through different neoliberal presidents there, Ecuador's security situation has gone from one of the safest countries in Latin America and the Caribbean to now one of the most dangerous, with one of the highest rates of homicide. Peru the country just to its south is another country that's also facing very high levels of violence. And I link these two countries because both had similar episodes, which I think draw out this larger issue. And so one is the fact that in Ecuador, just last week, 11 soldiers were killed by an illegal armed group in a mining region in the country. Apparently, they were going to do a check, and they essentially were ambushed by unidentified members of some criminal group in the country. This is, first of all, a very shocking thing. 11 soldiers killed by, again, kind of a group of bandits. It's very unclear, just what level of organization this armed group had. But again, 11 soldiers is a big amount. And they were, again, doing a patrol. This is a military which has received in recent months, especially under the presidency of Daniel Noboa, increased funds, increased support, increased training. So it does kind of boggle the mind how they could be doing a patrol in a region they already know is quite infested with criminal groups, and such a large number of them killed in essentially combat. And then to the south in Peru, there was a really tragic case, and again, in a mining area where criminal groups are increasing their control, increasing the amount of violence that they're kind of using to enforce control over the region. 13 miners had been kidnapped and kept underground in one of these sort of artisanal illegal not in an artisanal mine, but they were in this region with a proliferation of illegal mining. They were actually subcontractors of a large multinational corporation. They were kept hostage and kidnapped and then summarily executed by members of an armed group. Again, both incidents really sending shockwaves throughout society. In one case of soldiers, from the military, in another case, workers who were, again, abducted despite being, employees of a massive multinational corporation, both indicating this larger trend of this proliferation of criminal groups, of kind of this informal economy where mines are now under dispute between, not only between kind of illegal groups for artisanal mines, but even mining areas that are, allegedly controlled by multinational corporations. Again, it's a worrying trend because in both countries, there has been a complete breakdown of law and order. In the situation of Peru, we know that there was a coup against Pedro Castillo. Dina Boluarte came to power. She, during her time as de facto president, has, overseen, of course, the massive repression of people's movements, the crackdown. There has been multiple corruption scandals as well. But again, this overarching sense of breakdown of legitimacy, of order, of institutions, similar to what we've seen in Ecuador. And it's in these situations where the same insecurity that these governments claim that they're combating actually thrives. And so in Ecuador, as I said, the homicide rate Ecuador went from being one of the most peaceful countries in Latin America to having one of the highest homicide rates. There's presence of many different armed groups. We've covered at People's Dispatch this phenomenon of these prison massacres where gangs go to war in the prisons, where hundreds of people have been killed. There has been a state of emergency in Ecuador for over a year. And despite the state of emergency, despite the numerous states of emergencies that have been decreed in Peru, this insecurity, this violence continues. And who does it affect? It affects working people. And actually in Peru today, there's going to be a national strike that's organized in response not only to this massacre of miners, but also to a phenomenon that's happening in the city where street vendors, where transportation workers, cab drivers are forced to pay, are essentially extorted by armed groups that control different parts of the city. They're forced to pay not only what they have to do for their rent and for their usual taxes to the government, but they're also now having to pay armed groups. And they're coming out in this national strike to say, no more extortions, no more violence. And the government actually needs to take control of the country. And actually, in its whole discourse of combating corruption, of combating violence, it has actually not done that. And it's the people who are suffering. So it's a really difficult moment in both countries, but representative of what happens when institutions, when healthcare, when the public sector is completely gutted and people are really left with no other options, growth of armed groups, growth of insecurity, and worse conditions for the people. So that's where we're at in Latin America. And I know that hopping over to another continent, we're also dealing with a situation of deep and difficult violence.
Right, of course. Where it's like you said in West Asia, where we're going to go next. It's a very interesting moment right now because there's so much that's happened in the past week. One, of course, in some ways reflecting the violence you talked about, but also in other ways, like what we talk about, the zigs and zags of history proceeding in very strange ways. And of course, we'll start off with Yemen, for instance, where something quite remarkable has happened, which is that the United States and Yemen, Ansar Allah, which controls a large part of the country, have agreed on some kind of a ceasefire. Now, of course, this is portrayed by Donald Trump, who's now on a tour of that region, as something that he, out of his infinite mercy, had decided, and the people of Yemen couldn't fight any longer, so he decided to not continue. But media reports actually indicate that what has happened is that the United States figured out, after taking its own sweet time, that they were actually not able to achieve any of their goals. And after spending $1 billion worth of munitions in just over a month, that they were no closer to achieving their goals, which was to entirely destroy Ansar Allah and and hence create freedom of navigation in the region. So this is a remarkable achievement, because we saw this, unlike say some of the earlier strikes during Joe Biden's time, which are also quite brutal. These strikes were actually much more escalated. They were targeted civilian installations in their quest to kill Ansar Allah leaders. They were much more frequent. The military had almost a carte blanche in terms of conducting these strikes, and they went all out. And yet they kind of completely failed and suffered some embarrassing defeats. I think 7 Reaper drones downed by the Yemenis, 2 fighter jets falling off an aircraft carrier, at least one of them while trying to avoid a missile coming from Ansar Allah. Very extremely embarrassing for the most powerful military force in the world, that the scrappy force was able to do that. And then we have this kind of stalemate where they both agreed not to fire on each other. But Yemen said it would continue its attacks on Israel for this genocidal blockade on Gaza. So there is that, which is actually a major moment, I think, for West Asia, because there were sections in the US administration which were trying to use this bombing as a pretext to enable regime change again. And that seems to have now thankfully flopped. That plan does, at least on the surface, does not seem to be going through. So that's definitely, I think, a positive moment for the region. Simultaneously, on the other hand, we have the US and Iran conducting talks, and these talks actually kind of seem to be, right now, I think all we can say is that these talks being held itself is a major, a major positive in itself. Now, the question is that whether Israel can torpedo these talks. They're trying everything under the sun to torpedo these talks, to create an environment where these talks do not take place. But if this discussion can take place, we know Iran, for instance, has floated this idea of uranium enrichment being conducted by a group of partners. And if something like that comes into place, it is possible that it could heighten the rapprochement that has already been around for some time between Iran, Saudi Arabia, and some of these other countries. Equally important to note that apparently Trump, in his eagerness to get a deal or get the billions of dollars from Saudi Arabia, has apparently decided that he will not press Saudi Arabia to, sign the Abraham Accords with Israel. Now, of course, by de facto, the Saudis were, in some senses, still having close ties with Israel, but at least this is a moment of pushback for those very odious accords which sought to legitimize Israeli occupation and Israeli atrocities. So I think these 3 moments together are quite, quite interesting in terms of the kind of implications they have for the region. Now, of course, none of this changes the fact that the people of Gaza are going through a horrendous situation, the famine they're facing, Israel's plans of all-out occupying Gaza continuing, the US planning some kind of humanitarian mission which will actually formalize the displacement, the ethnic cleansing of a large number of people. None of what I talked actually subtracts from that horror. But the fact that there are some moves in this direction or in an opposite direction, even if they may be short-lived and even if they may not be long-term, are, I think, something to look out for and may have some implications which you won't be able to calculate. So I think very, very important time to keep watching what's happening in West Asia. People's Dispatch, of course, very actively covering all of these developments. And I think keeping these three axes in mind is very important right now.
Definitely. And I think in the coming hours and perhaps coming days, we're definitely going to hear more as Trump continues his tour throughout the region. And notably, perhaps we'll travel to Turkey tomorrow for some updates on Russia, Ukraine. So it's a pretty active week in terms of foreign policy, of course, coming on the heels of the visits of several heads of state from the Global South to Moscow for the Victory Day celebrations, which we spoke about last week. Many of those heads of state continued their journey and went from Moscow to China, where just yesterday and continuing on today, there's more meetings between the CELAC bloc of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States and China, which is an extremely, extremely important set of meetings. Yesterday, Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia, Lula da Silva, president of Brazil, Gabriel Boric, to many people's surprise, participated in this meeting. Bruno Rodriguez, the foreign minister of Cuba, in the high-level CELAC-China meeting to discuss deepening ties between China and the Latin American bloc. And this is a very crucial thing to note at this time, because not only were several of those leaders actually present in the Victory Day celebrations in Russia, which the West strictly said, I mean, Western Europe specifically said, think twice about going. And of course, the Global South said, I'll go where I want. And that's why we saw so many heads of state like Lula da Silva, like Ibrahim Traoré, participating in this commemoration in Moscow, but now continuing and going to China, which is currently, at loggerheads in a sense with the United States. We know that there was an agreement reached, which Prasanth, you'll get to in a minute. But the fact that they're going to Beijing and saying, actually, Latin American and Chinese cooperation is of the utmost importance. Gustavo Petro, who did not go to Moscow, actually traveled specifically just to Beijing for this meeting and for a bilateral meeting, Colombia-China. And it's important to note that Latin America and the Caribbean, it's worth repeating, the U.S. really has considered the region to be its backyard. The continuation of the Monroe Doctrine, the attempt to continually exercise U.S. control and authority over the region, we've seen it directly with how the U.S. treats Panama, saying the Panama Canal is ours and China can have no privileged, conditions to be able to use the Panama Canal. The U.S. would like that to just be its complete domain, yet all of these Latin American leaders traveled to China. In many countries in South America specifically, China is actually the main trading partner. It is no longer the United States. There is a mega port that was built in Peru, the Chancay port. This has become a central node for trade to operate in the region. We know Chile, also a huge and major trading partner, is China for that country. And in the Caribbean and in Central America, it continues to be the United States. Of course, the proximity is so close, but again, more ties being opened, more relationships being developed. And I think that the fact that this meeting was held in this juncture, when the whole world is kind of up in arms in response to Trump's reciprocal tariff threats, it's a very strong message, because once again, the US has shown that being a friend, being a trading partner of the United States is an extremely unstable and difficult to rely on relationship. If one day you have no tariffs and the next day you have 30% tariffs, and then they go down the next day, what does that say about kind of the long-term economic stability of countries that, again, are still developing nations are still countries that are trying to develop their productive forces, advance industrialization. So this meeting, again, occupies a very, very important role, and it's sending a very important message. And at the same time, or just prior to that, another meeting was taking place, but in Geneva. Prasanth, what was happening between that?
Right, that's another very fascinating story, an ongoing story. China and the US deciding to scale back their tariffs on each other. Of course, the tariffs were a result of Trump's what are called Liberation Day reciprocal tariffs. Of course, the tariffs in China had started much before, but he really intensified it with his Liberation Day tariffs on April 2nd. Sounds like a Terminator sequence almost. But basically, what happens is that both of them had decided to cut down their tariffs by, I believe, 115%. So the tariffs on the US tariffs on Chinese goods will remain at 30%. China's tariffs on US goods will remain at 10%. That's also because China had decided that they would stop their tariffs at 125%, because after that it doesn't make sense anymore to keep increasing, and it's just rhetorical. Now, this is good for a lot of people, good for customers in the US who were likely to see a massive amount of inflation, good for the US economy, and once again, hence, for US customers who were likely to see a stagnation in their growth, leading to what is called stagflation, which, according to economists, is one of the most dreaded outcomes that you can face, a stagnation and inflation together. Good for Chinese producers as well, who would have definitely taken a hit if the US market had been completely cut off from them. Most estimates said that both countries' GDP would suffer, although the US GDP was likely to suffer much more. Analysts have kind of said that, ever since Trump's first term, when he imposed tariffs on China had slowly kind of begun to diversify its markets, and so was no longer as dependent on the US as it had been. I think there's also the question of, the tariffs as, of course, a political weapon meant to sort of show the people, meant for a domestic audience, Trump trying to prove that he's, a person of decisive action, all of that factoring in without really looking at the consequences. And that since April 2nd, we saw the time and again. First, the tariffs led to this massive crisis in the US bond markets, which forced him to withdraw those tariffs for most countries. Then they tried to do this whole thing of trying to create a coalition of the willing, which would isolate China, which is not really working. Then Trump and his folks realized that actually a lot of US electronics companies needed would be in deep crisis if the tariffs on electronics continued. So he ended up exempting smartphones, computers, etc. from those tariffs. And I think each step was a realization that this system of just imposing tariffs does not really kind of work. On the one hand, the global economy is very interconnected. On the other hand, this system of the US running a deficit which they want to take care of, or the US not having an industrial base, which is really what Trump supposedly wants to address, is the result of their own policy. And I think this is something economists around the world have pointed out, especially in the global south, that the US industrial decline is not because of China or Vietnam or Indonesia or India or Malaysia. It is because the US capital in the US decided that the best way to go about their, the best, most convenient way for them was to turn into financialization and send all that production outside, so that they would actually have to spend way less money and then, completely financialize the US economy. And what this led to, of course, is that the production entirely went abroad. But if they thought that all these countries would just continue producing cheap goods and send it to the United States while the US would remain the tech hegemon, that is not going to happen. People, countries expand, countries develop, and countries, their production capacity, they rise in scale. And so now we have a scene where the US industry is kind of completely in tatters. Various countries are progressing very quickly. It's not just China, it's also Vietnam, it's also India for that matter. All of them are progressing quite rapidly in terms of their industrial capacity. And just imposing tariffs one fine day is not going to bring those industries back, or the money back for that matter. So this is a horribly misguided a series of policies which will just, badly affect economies across the world. Some economies, the economies which can continue to produce, which are, which can continue to increase demand internally, which can build good networks with their neighbors, they are in a better position to survive even in this world, even with all those tariffs. Whereas the countries like the United States, which do not have the capacity to produce anymore, will go into a crisis even with these tariffs. So the tariffs no longer really are going to help them. So I think it was just practical wisdom that led that forced the US to kind of withdraw from this measure, and hopefully the talks continue and they lead to better results, so that there can be some more stability in the world economy, because I think that's really badly needed right now. And I think that's the best I can do, being a non-economist, in understanding and explaining this issue. So, yeah.
Well, certainly it also is a pretty strong political blow to Trump's political project, who has insisted time and time again, I'm the only person to be using tariffs in this way, and look exactly where that sent him. So, this image of grandeur of Trump can do anything, he can command the entire world, was also suffered a major blow. So, important note there. And with that, we will wrap up this episode of Give the People What They Want. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for following. Make sure to share this episode. It is available, of course, on YouTube and on Spotify later as a podcast. We, of course, love and count on your support. Go to peoplesdispatch.org, read our stories, follow us on all social media platforms. We'll be back next week, surely with more stories, hopefully with more peace, hopefully with ceasefire negotiations resolved. We will always be hoping for that. And we'll never say that we won't be, because we are journalists who believe in humanity and believe in peace, and do not want war to continue. So thanks again, and we'll see you next week.